Fighters continue to make gains in Iraq despite years of U.S. efforts and billions of dollars spent training Iraqi security forces. Last week, U.S. President Barack Obama announced that an additional 450 U.S. advisors will be sent to Iraq to train and assist the Iraqi army in the fight against Islamic State. Joining us now from Los Angeles is Majid Rafizadeh. He is a political scientist and expert on U.S. foreign policy and the Middle East. With us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Raed Jarrar. He immigrated to the United States from Iraq in 2005 and is a U.S. government relations manager at the American Friends Service Committee. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Raed, let's talk first about this new U.S. effort to counter ISIL in the Middle East. The U.S. is now talking about sending additional forces to train Iraqi forces. Is this going to make a difference?
Absolutely not. There is nothing new about this. Other than it being deteriorating policy. It's even worse than before. The U.S. has been trying to train Iraqi forces and claiming that this is the main issue that has to be paid attention to. I don't think there is a crisis of training in Iraq. It's a crisis of legitimacy of these forces, a crisis of identity of the forces, not really a crisis of teaching someone to hold a gun. Moreover, this training actually emphasizes a new U.S. policy to treat Iraq as three different countries. Sunnis and Kurds and Shiites are being treated as de facto three countries, and sending 450 additional troops to train Iraqi Sunnis without going through the Iraqi central government is another example of how U.S. policies have contributed to the division of Iraq.
Majid, what do you think? Do you see a grand strategic plan here on the part of the United States when it says it's going to deploy another 450 trainers to train Iraqi forces? Or is this the United States just reacting to one crisis after another without any plan?
I agree with you and with Raed. I think the grand military strategy that the United States is talking about, it's really not grand military strategy. Their response is just reacting to how the events are unfolding in the Middle East, not really having a comprehensive strategy to deal with multilateral conflicts in the region. So I think they have to deal with the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is not just conducting thousands of airstrike and killing a couple of leaders of the Islamic State or other extremist group. I think they have to look at the political systems of the Iraqi government. They have to look at the conflict in Syria. They have to look at those communities which are disenfranchised in the region, some of the Sunni which are not included in the political system of the Iraqi government. So I think the problem is, the underlying problem is very deep, and you can't address the problem just by using the military or by just conducting some airstrike. I think you have to have a really not only grand military strategy, but a grand social, economical, and political strategy which address the problem.
Right, and right, that is not something we're going to see in the short term, is it? I mean, at this stage, ISIL is being described as the gravest threat to stability in the Middle East. I mean, is that an exaggeration, or do they pose a serious threat to stability there?
I'm sure there is some threat posed by ISIS. What I differ from this analysis, though, is that I don't think ISIS or Al-Qaeda are the real problem. They are manifestations of the real problem. There are root causes that caused, that made us reach to this point now. And these include the lack of strong central governments in Iraq and Syria. They include the lack of strong national identity and the introduction of ethno-sectarian politics in the region. So the fact that ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other extremist groups exist is a manifestation. And the other point to keep in mind is that there are groups that exist on the other side of the sectarian spectrum, whether they were Shiites or whether they were Kurdish troops, who are as violent and brutal as ISIS. So ISIS is not really an exception anymore. It's an example of how sectarian and ethnic militias look like. These are definitely the results of disastrous policies that have been taking place in the region for the last decades.
Majid, a few years ago, we never heard of ISIL. We didn't know who they were. Now, we hear about them every day. How did this group, relatively small, become so powerful so quickly?
Well, there are a couple of factors. I think you see here some kind of symbiotic relationship. You have dictators in the region, for instance, Bashar al-Assad, using violence against the oppositional groups, and the violence fuels extremism, and the extremism again fights with Bashar, which causes him to use more brute force. And this is also true when it comes to the United States. It picks some of the groups to find with the Sunni extremism, and that again fuels more Sunni extremism. So you have kind of a vicious circle going on. But back to your question, I think the main reason that you saw some kind of significant rise in the power of the Islamic State, from my perspective, is the conflict in Syria. They had some kind of power from 2000. After U.S. invasion in Iraq until 2009-10, but I think the Syrian conflict created the perfect environment for them. But also they rely on some methods which is different from Al-Qaeda. For instance, for gaining financial means, they don't use the modern international financial system like banking. They don't use a strategy of hit and run like Al-Qaeda. They have, I think, a more bureaucratic system that has proved to be some kind of successful. So I think there are several factors. They also capitalize on the grievances of the people, of sentiments of opposing American imperialism in the region. So I think there are several factors that plays into their into the increasing power of this group.
Right. ISIL's stated aim is to create this caliphate in the Middle East, this state, this Islamic State that's going to be there. What is the U.S., what is the threat they pose to the U.S.?
That's a good question. I think most of the U.S. intelligence reports about this puts the threat of ISIS on the U.S. On very minimal terms. I don't think there is real threat that ISIS can pose to the United States. And ISIS definitely is not posing real threat to regional powers. You know, they can't invade Turkey or Iran or Jordan. They thrive in states that are destabilized and very weak, like Iraq and in Syria. So I think some of their threats are exaggerated for political reasons. These threats are, in many cases, convenient to many local and regional and international powers. Many voices in the U.S. are using the exaggerated threats of ISIS to justify more military spending, more intervention in the region. Many voices in Syria and Iraq are using ISIS to justify other agendas, whether it's showing that the opposition in Syria is scary and monstrous, or whether showing that Iraqi Sunnis want to separate, which is something that most of the Shiite and Kurdish ruling parties have been calling for since 2003. They haven't found a Sunni partner to separate before ISIS. So it's not very inconvenient to many of the powers to be, and I think that's why we hear a lot about its threats and the exaggerations of its threats.
And Majid, if we look at the region itself, does Turkey have a role in countering ISIL? At this stage, the government in Ankara has been very reluctant to act against ISIL, and of course that's caused a lot of anger in places like Washington.
Yeah, I think you see a lot of double standards, I think, going around from the governments in the region as well. On the one hand, Turkey wants to see that Assad is overthrown. They want to overthrow the Assad regime. So they opened their border for some rebel group or some extremist group to enter Syria. But that, again, created a problem for them when they saw the rise of the Islamic State and when the Kurdish, I think, problem came up. And so I think, again, that goes back to the kind of political hypocrisy or double standard you see in the region going on. I think you can blame every country basically in the region to either have directly or indirectly created this Islamic, this extremist group, and now by fighting these groups or by using different kind of let's say Shiite group to fight with the Sunni groups, they are again fueling more extremism in the region.
And right, one of the other things that ISIL has been able to do pretty effectively is recruit young people around the world. They have a propaganda arm that's been very effective in doing that. What is the attraction for young people?
We don't really have very accurate numbers about that either, because it is one of the issues that has been exaggerated. The numbers seem to be very limited when you look at the larger picture. Moreover, it seems that the U.S. has been using that as a tactic to arrest or get rid of extremists here in the U.S. So the FBI poses as ISIS recruiters and they ask young American Muslims to join them, and then once they agree, they arrest them. So many of the calls for recruitment is actually not coming from ISIS per se. It's coming from FBI agents acting as ISIS. The point to be, though, is that there is a real crisis happening in the region, and the U.S. intervention there is a part of the problem. Many people who don't like ISIS, they don't believe in ISIS's policies or agendas or ideology, are still willing to fight along ISIS's side against a U.S. intervention or against what they see to be a brutal Iraqi or Syrian dictatorships and sectarian forces. So you have two forces at hand. You have ISIS and its capability to invite people to join, and then you have other forces with push factors, pushing people to go to the other side, even if they didn't agree with ISIS. So I would say in many cases, the push factor is more effective in recruiting for ISIS than the pull factor.
Okay.